Just confirm that we're live here. Good afternoon. Today I'm going to do a couple of readings. These are behind the scenes, so there's no warranty here. I normally take my readings and edit them so that you don't get all my ahs and my speech impediment. But today I'm going to do these two readings, one of which I need for tomorrow's Carl Jung Depth Psychology reading group regular meeting, and that will be the first one. It's about speaking in tongues, which is very popular among American fundamentalists, and then I'm going to talk about God's only daughter. So let me just plug my iPhone in. I'm also broadcasting this through Periscope on my iPhone, and so anyway, the first thing I wanted to read, I'm reading today from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology by Dr. Lawrence Jaffe. And the first passage that I'm going to read is a passage that I need for Monday evening's 8 o'clock regular meeting of the reading group. And let me just show that I'm online on the chat. So I'm going to first read about speaking in tongues. I'm not really going to discuss it per se. That discussion will be for tomorrow evening's reading group session. But I wanted to prepare the video so that I have it for tomorrow. So this comes from pages 118 to 120 of Dr. Jaffe's book, in a section called Individuation and the Holy Spirit, Pentecost. In Acts, we read, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly a sound came from heaven, like the rush of a mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributed and resting on each one of them. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues, as the Spirit gave them utterance. Footnote, Acts 2, 1 through 4. The scriptural narrative goes on to describe how a crowd, many of whom were foreigners, quickly gathered, and how each listener, and this was the wonder of it, heard the apostle speaking in his or her own tongue. This story reminded me of an experience recounted by Gerhard Adler, how upon departing from a lecture of Jung's, he shared with friends his astonishment that in his talk, Jung seemed to be addressing Adler's precise concerns. To Adler's surprise, both his friends took exception, each claiming that their own personal, quite different preoccupations were what Jung had been addressing. I have heard and read similar accounts from other patients of Jung's, in which he seemed to be speaking to the very essence of their concerns which they had not yet revealed to him. For instance, there are accounts of patients coming to their session prepared to discuss an important dream, but treated instead to an hour-long monologue from Jung. The amazing thing was that Jung's words seemed in the highest degree relevant to their dream, and they departed feeling that no direct interpretation could have achieved more for their understanding of it. This seems to be what happens in the company of one who is speaking from the self, that is, out of a connection with God, or out of his or her wholeness, out of a connection with God, or out of his or her wholeness. In the scriptural passage we are considering, Peter quotes the words of the prophet Joel in explanation of the phenomenon of speaking in tongues. Quote, "And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams." That's from Acts 2:17. The idea is that in the age we are now entering, the age of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, every man and woman will be capable of gaining access to the depths out of which Jung spoke. It is when we can leave our personal complexes behind that our experience attains more universal relevance. This cannot be achieved through an egocentric wish for power, but is a grace bestowed upon one. As Jesus said, "You did not choose me, no, I chose you." Okay, so that's the section I wanted to read about speaking in tongues. I'll have more to say about that tomorrow evening in our regular meeting, which begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Eastern Daylight Time. And for the benefit of the Periscope people, it should be also on Periscope, I hope. But if not, you will be able to find it on the YouTube channel called Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. And so, and for the Periscope people, you can check my profile for the link on that. Okay, so hello, thank you for joining. It's nice to see you. I wanted to read to you today about God's only daughter. And obviously you can see that I'm a bit emotional about it, so obviously it's touched a complex within me. And so I'm reading today from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology by Dr. Lawrence Jaffe. And I'm reading from chapter 9, beginning on page 123. And the title of the chapter is The Sabbath, God's Only Daughter. There are two quotes before the beginning of the chapter. "Busy, busy, busy." That's a popular saying. The second quote is, "Nobody has time anymore to look at a flower." That quote comes from Georgia O'Keeffe. The next section is titled, or the first section of the chapter is titled, "The Jew's Great Contribution." Of course, Dr. Jaffe, as many of you know, Dr. Jaffe was Jewish. Dr. Jaffe was Jewish, and so he is writing from his Jewish perspective, although later in his life, excuse me while I sneeze, this is how, let's see. This is what you get when you log on to the behind the scenes. Sorry. I'll be cutting that out of the video, but unfortunately it's you're getting sharing my allergy season. Late in his life, Dr. Jaffe did not profess any creed, but he spoke from all creeds. And in this book, he very frequently speaks from a Christian perspective. But in this section, he's referring to the Old Testament. He's primarily referring to the Old Testament. And the title is The Jews' Great Contribution. Hi, Rural Inventor. Welcome to the session. Don't hesitate to ask questions. And hello, my Mimi is the best. Nice to see you on Periscope. So anyway, going on. If, as I once read in a statistic book of all places, quote, the world is real, the quote, the world of reality is a world of limitations, unquote. This is from a book by Q. McNamara called Psychological Statistics. I'll start that again. If, as I once read in a statistic book of all places, the world of reality is a world of limitations, the inner world would be, by contrast, a world of absolutes. We need absolutes to live fully. For instance, we need to know that in a certain sense, each one of us is of infinite value. The Israelites were the first to worship a God who loved them to excess. To God, they were special, a holy people that He bound to Himself in a covenant. Jung writes, quote, Yahweh compelled a personal relationship between Himself and man, who could not help but feel personally called by Him. That was the essential difference between Yahweh and the all-ruling Father Zeus. I've always said it Zeus, but I think others pronounce it Zeus. So that was the essential difference between Yahweh and the all-ruling Father Zeus, who in a benevolent and somewhat detached manner allowed the economy of the universe to roll along on its accustomed courses and punished only those who were disorderly. He did not moralize, but ruled purely instinctively. He did not demand anything more from human beings than the sacrifices due to him. He did not want to do anything with human beings because he had no plans for them. Father Zeus is certainly a figure, but not a personality. Yahweh, on the other hand, was interested in man. Human beings were a matter of first-grade importance to him. He needed them as they needed him, urgently and personally. Against mankind as a whole, Zeus had no objections, but then they did not interest him all that much. Yahweh, however, could get inordinately excited about man as a species and men as individuals if they did not behave as he desired or expected. There's a footnote. Answer to Job, paragraph 568. Interpreted psychologically, bondage to God in a covenant suggests that in order to keep one's integrity, one must regularly turn one's attention inward, toward God. This is why keeping the Sabbath day holy is one of the 10 Commandments. It means the same as turning one's energies inward, away from worldly concerns, a sacrifice because it produces no tangible result. The world, on the other hand, would claim all of our energies. The list of important things to do in the world is endless. The next section, the Sabbath as release from this world. The 11th chapter of Matthew opens with what could be construed as Jesus evaluating the success of his ministry. First John the Baptist questions Jesus' authority. Then Jesus berates his contemporaries for the resistance to the gospel. Next in the scriptural narrative, Christ appears to rediscover his proper connection to the self, God, with the words, "Yea, Father, for such was thy gracious will." And these quotes are from Matthew 11:26 and Matthew 11:28-30. Then, having recovered his with the words, "Yea, Father, for such was thy gracious will." Then, having recovered his equilibrium, he preaches a relationship to the self in which the ego is humble and submissive, not inflated with power drives and lust for gain from which even Jesus, partaking of our human nature, was not immune. He invites us, quote, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's the quote from Matthew 11:28-30. In our day, no less than in Jesus's, many are laden with worry, toil, and care. We may consider this state to be no more than the fulfillment of our obligations to the outer world, but from the point of view of the inner world, all that outwardly directed work may not be necessary. Work can and will take up all of one's time and energy with nothing left over for God. The subjective world, the psyche, the eternal world will be neglected. That is why the Sabbath was created, to demarcate and structure a regular and collectively sanctioned time when individuals could be freed from worldly obligations. The demands made upon us by the physical universe are infinite. To cite just one example, the possibilities of home improvement are limitless. To cite just one example, the possibilities of home improvement are limitless. Cooking and cleaning and washing and shopping and gardening and childcare and car care and care of clothing and record keeping and errand running. The list is endless. That is why we need the Sabbath, so we can devote ourselves to the inner world. That these speculations are not lacking foundation is suggested by the sequence of events in the Gospels where, in the very next episode, the subject of the Sabbath comes up. Jesus and his disciples are challenged as to their actions on the Sabbath, and Jesus declares, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." This is in accord with the new dispensation, which supersedes the law. The Word of God is no longer writ indelibly in stone, but is revealed in dialogue with man. The next section is entitled Prayer. Restore to us the holy Sabbath, O Lord. Do you know what this could mean? Can you imagine a day reserved each week when work, even that which is pleasing to some, like gardening or home improvement, would be forbidden? We would have no choice but to prune our souls, repair our minds, and order our relationships with our loved or hated ones again. The TV and the stereo would be silenced. Likewise, the intrusive ring of the devil's own device, the telephone. So too would the aggressive machine, the auto, be stilled. Perusing that silent sea of time, what unsuspected thoughts or feelings might arise? One could just stay home and talk to another or to oneself, commune with oneself, talk and listen. Can you imagine the stillness, the silence? Silent the motorcycles, the lawnmowers, and the leaf blowers, the buzz of the chainsaws, too. A kind of Christmas once a week, a night holy and still, and a day holy and still. Can you imagine in that silence what healing? Restore to us the holy Sabbath, O Lord. Next section is entitled, How the Sabbath Imposed Itself on Me. I've had as much trouble as the next person in setting aside a Sabbath, but I noticed that on Friday night an atmosphere of tension frequently prevailed in our home, as if my whole family were expecting something. Satisfaction of our needs is the way I put it to myself. It was as if we had worked hard all week and expected a reward. Perhaps that cycle of work and reward, written in our bones, reflects the archetype of the Sabbath. As the children grew older and more differentiated, it became harder to agree on what kind of food to have, or what movie to see, or for that matter, whether to go out at all. So family members more and more pursued their satisfactions individually. Perhaps the precious and fulfilling reward for a week's work would have been the reuniting of the family in wholeness and harmony, as if all the contending fragments had at last been reconciled. The paradisal feeling that accompanies this fantasy is an expression of the family archetype in its positive aspect. But only something of higher value than any individual ego can provide a center capable of drawing all the diverse egos together. On the Sabbath, in the midst of silence, we once contemplated God, but we are now, for a short time in history, orphaned from God, and because we lack a center, something more important than ego concerns, our children too are orphaned. Then for many years, I'm going to skip that part. I'm now reading from page 127. I now recognize it is not merely reward that the Sabbath is about, but death and rebirth. Death, because letting go of the work week means acceptance of the defeats and disappointments that were inherent in it, admitting I didn't accomplish as much as I had hoped. rebirth, because in that process my sins, mostly shortcomings, are forgiven, or increasingly with age forgotten, and I am cleansed and prepared to approach the world afresh. And writing this, I realize some people must accomplish the same thing with leaf blower or dirt bike, but must it blast so? Hi, Gray. Happy Sunday. So I'm reading about Sabbath today. What the Sabbath does for us. It is a symptom of our spiritual. It is a symptom of our spiritually benighted age that the impact the Sabbath day could have on our lives has been forgotten. As the shadows lengthen on a Friday eve, a gentle hush falls upon the shtetl. A gentle hush. I'm not Jewish, so I can't pronounce Hebrew words very well, but I will try. A gentle hush falls upon the shtetl, and the holy Sabbath, as a bride prepares to make her entrance. Then the cares of this world are dispelled, and a beautiful silence remains to greet her. As Jesus said, "In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." Footnote, John 16:33. But be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. John 16:33. There is no end of troubles in the world, for its limitations are inescapable. The maladjusted person is one who refuses to admit the relativity, complexity, and impersonality of the outer world and imposes upon it the inner world of absolutes in an illegitimate, that is, unadapted fashion. The world of reality is a world in which everything is relative, everything is conditional. It is a realm of parts. There is always another side to be considered, and the issues are usually complex and multifaceted, denying us the satisfaction of a simple solution. The Sabbath is meant to compensate for this gray world with its boxes. The Sabbath is meant to compensate for this gray world and its boxes by giving us an experience of eternity, a timeless, limitless world. The Sabbath. The Sabbath is God's only daughter. The Sabbath is God's only daughter. Footnote. A.J. Heschel, The Sabbath. The next section is entitled, "Something Within Can Redeem Us." My kingdom is not of this world. John 18:36. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field which someone has found. He hides it again, goes off happy, sells everything he owns, and buys the field. Matthew 13:44. Jung's commentary on these lines is worth quoting at length. The aim of the great religions is expressed in the aim of the great religions is expressed in the injunction, "not of this world," and this implies the inward movement of libido into the unconscious, its withdrawal and introversion Its withdrawal and introversion create in the unconscious a concentration of libido, which is symbolized as the treasure. The soul is a personification of the unconscious, where lies the treasure, the libido, which is immersed in introversion and is allegorized as God's kingdom. This amounts to a permanent union with God, a living in his kingdom, in that state where a preponderance of libido lies in the unconscious and determines conscious life. The libido concentrated in the unconscious was formerly invested in objects, and this made the world seem all-powerful. God was then outside, but now he works from within, as the hidden treasure conceived as God's kingdom. Footnote, that's from Psychological Types, Collected Works, Volume 6, paragraphs 423 and 424. Jung's message may be summarized in the words, "Man has a soul, and there is a treasure buried in the field. The field is an individual's subjective experience. In our time, it is thought to be of little value. The treasure is God, the highest value. Another way to say it is that if we live our life true to our inner experience, fully, sincerely, and devotedly, as Jesus did, we will find redemption. Psychologically speaking, we will be more complete, that is, individuated. Everything we need is to be found within us. This is a truth that is hard to hold on to, partly because in the world's most extroverted society, America, we are constantly being assured that what we need lies outside of us, in the shopping center, the church social hall, or the university. And the pundits scratch their heads wondering why, when Americans are better off economically than they've ever been before, is the national mood so discontented? No better answer exists than may be found in Scripture. Quote, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Footnote, Matthew 4:4 and Deuteronomy 8:3. I guess we still have some time here, so I'm going to read this last section. So Dr. Jaffe was a psychoanalyst. He was a Jungian analyst practicing in Berkeley, California. He died 15 years ago, but the next section is called Psychotherapy as Sabbath. For some, the weekly psychotherapy hour now serves as a kind of Sabbath. At that appointed day and time, the patient's thoughts turn inward as he or she pauses and asks, "Who am I that all this should be happening to me?" This question reflects the religious attitude, which considers carefully one's experience and takes the subject of the experience oneself into full account. As a psychotherapist, I feel I perform no more important function than to hold the psychotherapeutic hour sacred, thereby affirming the dignity and the worth of the inner world. I have it as a rule that unless I receive 24 hours notice, patients are charged for the hour whether or not they make use of it. The apparent harshness of the rule is to help keep the psychotherapeutic hour inviolable. The apparent harshness of the rule is to help keep the psychotherapeutic hour inviolable. The demands of the inner world are easily set aside because the unconscious speaks at first in whispers. The penalty for violating the Sabbath in biblical times was death. The penalty was severe not only because of the weight given that commandment by our fathers, but because of the ease with which worldly matters take precedence over matters of the soul. Cancellations are infrequent in my practice, but this week I had 2. I spoke to both patients briefly on the phone. The young man said his long-awaited motorcycle was ready and he was anxious to pick it up. The young woman explained she had to take her mother to the hospital, and besides she had to work. For both patients, it was their first cancellation. When I next see them, I will bring up the subject, and in discussing it, I think they will realize that there is at least one person in the world, their therapist, who believes that what goes on inside of them, their psyche, is as important as their outer affairs. I find I influence my patients to take their inner world more seriously because I take it seriously, not only in my words, but in my life. So when I have such a rule as this, and when in addition I start my sessions on time and finish on time, my actions bear witness to my belief in the sanctity of the psychotherapeutic hour. Some of my fellow therapists think that it expresses a healthy liberality of mind to say extend the psychotherapy hour when the patient is late, or to make last-minute changes in scheduling to accommodate patient or therapist. But the message that comes across unconsciously, I think, is that the therapy hour must give way to worldly considerations. That is, Caesar's world is more important than God's. And when patients consider cutting down the frequency of their appointments or terminating altogether, therapists are often loath to oppose their will, thinking they have no right to try to keep the patient in therapy. There are times, however, when patients need encouragement to set aside a regular time to attend to that depreciated and neglected part of themselves. The least of these is my brethren, that is so deserving of respect and consideration. By contrast, the extroverted attitude is focused on the goal, an attitude which, while perfectly appropriate in its own domain, is not appropriate to the inner world where activities characterizing the feminine spirit predominate. Circumambulating, accepting, waiting, ripening. Let us not emulate the ancient Romans who, when they first encountered the Hebrews, ascribed their observance of a day of rest to indolence. It reflects not indolence, but a consciousness which recognizes the existence and importance of an inner world. And as in the outer world, attention and devotion to the inner world is likely to be rewarded, one such reward being enhanced self-esteem. In this dark age of the soul, the West has forgotten how to look at things with the inner eye. Not only has Jung called this one-sidedness to our attention, others have done the same, but he has revisioned the subjective aspect of life, for that is what we are missing. in psychological terms, what are more acceptable to our reason. In psychological terms, which are more acceptable to our reason, as it is written, "For this commandment which I command thee this day, it is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven, neither is it beyond the sea." But the word is very near unto thee, in thy mouth and in thy heart, that thou mayest do it. Deuteronomy 30:11 through 14. In other words, observance of the Sabbath or engagement in an equivalent activity, such as psychotherapy, which honors the inner world, may provide us with access to it. Therefore, as it is written, "Choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live." Deuteronomy 30:19. Okay. So that's all I was going to read today, and this has been a relatively short session. But if you have any questions, I'll try to check over on Periscope here to see if you folks are asking anything. I beg your pardon for my allergy. Tis the season. I've been this passage about the Sabbath is very meaningful to me because I've been going through a fairly rough time in my own life, which has involved preparing some litigation papers. And I very often, when that happens, I'm an attorney, but I haven't practiced actively since 1979. I found that I loved going to law school, but I detested the practice of law, so I left the practice of law in 1979 actively. However, from time to time I get myself involved in litigation, and I still detest it. And anyway, when I have to write papers like that, I find that my unconscious and I are often wrestling. And that's happened to me this weekend, even though my wife is away from Friday through today. I've been having a hard time wrestling with my psyche about getting this work done that needs to be done. And so I know very definitely how important this is. And so since I had discovered this section about the Sabbath this week, I decided that maybe my psyche thinks that recording this reading of Dr. Jaffe's chapter about the Sabbath is more important than the other work, which I still have another week to accomplish, so I can step back from it as you might want to step back from cutting the grass or whatever it is, and just take some time off for yourself. Just go for a walk or meditate or whatever it is you do to give your soul a chance to heal. This is what we all need, and I think this is what Dr. Jung and Dr. Jaffe were both referring to. Obviously, for men living 3,000 years ago, they spoke of this in terms of the metaphor of the metaphysical God, but nonetheless, all things are of the psyche, and we've since discovered that what is of the metaphysical God and what is of the God image, what is of the God image, which is the empirical self, which can be demonstrated by psychotherapists, is indistinguishable by human beings. And therefore, we, we need to get back to thinking about this inner part of ourselves. And certainly, as I look around in my community in the United States, I see many of my fellow Americans, most of my fellow Americans, at the mall or making sure that they put fancy cars in their driveway. And those are all goals for the physical world. Those are render unto Caesar. Those are all goals in the outer world, in the extroverted physical world. But they do nothing for your soul. And so if you're following these videos, chances are you have an inkling that there's something missing in your life, as Dr. Jung felt when he started his Red Book period and began with the search for his own soul. And so I urge you to take some time out on a regular basis, find a way to do it. It doesn't matter following what faith you do it. You can be a Zoroastrian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Jew or a Catholic or a Protestant. We all have our ways to pray and turn inward. And what many of us don't understand is that's what we're supposed to be doing. God isn't out there. Okay, that's what the astronomers have been showing us for decades now. God is not out there, notwithstanding whatever you were ever told in Sunday school. God is here, and we need to address that part of ourselves. Now I'll just look at some of these comments. Gray says, do most Westerners fear Sabbath? I think of our esteemed brothers having such a keener sense of self. I think of our Eastern brothers having such a keener sense of self-reflection. Well, certainly that's true, and Dr. Jung felt that the Buddhists, at least, were starting from the self end of the spectrum, and I think it's probably true that we fear Sabbath. And I'll give you an example. When I was, up until the time I was 40 years old or so, I was like everybody else. I was putting earbuds in my ears all the time. And whenever I was driving the car, especially when I was driving alone and didn't have someone to talk to, I always had to have music on. And it was almost as if I finally realized when I was about 40 that it was almost as if I was afraid of my own thoughts. And so I was suppressing them with the music. And there came a day about 30 years ago now where I just turned off the radio and I stopped listening to music constantly. And I found that I had a steady flow of thoughts. And I don't know if that was based on a Jungian influence. Certainly about that time I was starting to study Dr. Jung. But I turned off the radio and I started to just listen to myself. And I found it not fearsome, and I found it extremely useful for myself in very many ways, but ways that are intangible and I probably can't speak to directly here, but I certainly think that we may be afraid to hear our own thoughts. And so it is useful to contemplate that if that's happening to you. Nowadays, when I'm trying, usually if I'm listening to something on a recording, it's usually a book where I'm trying to learn something while I'm driving, coming back from taking my wife to work or something like that. And I drive, on those days, I have about an hour in the car in the two directions when I'm alone, and I use that time to learn something new usually. And it was in that way that I first read Dr. Jung's first really important book, which is Psychology of the Unconscious. It was reissued 40 years later as Transformations, Symbols of Transformation, I'm sorry. And actually that was always its name in German. But when it came out in 1916 in the United States, Beatrice Hinkle, who was the translator, decided to call it Psychology of the Unconscious. Anyway, it was reissued. Both versions are available, but there's a very excellent reading of it by Robert Bethune on audible.com. And when I first started to get into Dr. Jung's direct writings, I started by listening to that book, and it suddenly started to make a lot of sense to me, reading that. And there was another one I was reading, which is Modern Man in Search of a Soul. Those are both available on audible.com. And I actually have probably read Psychology of the Unconscious, the 1912 version, probably 5 times at least on audio. And then I got Symbols of Transformation, the rewrite, which was 40 years later. And of course that book is quite different and quite a bit more comprehensive, but both books are good. And I found by listening to the Audible first, it was a way to get into Jungian psychology and into Dr. Jung's serious writing directly, because I was finding that somehow the people that were writing about Dr. Jung that I was familiar with, who are contemporary people still alive today, were not really letting me in on the secret. And it was only when I started to read Jung and his direct disciples like Erich Neumann and Esther Harding that I started to really appreciate the depth of what he was saying. And so those are reflections on that. Grace says, Yahweh making missing Sabbath punishable by death is very telling for someone reading Answer to Job. Or just reading Job. I think if we don't address our psyche can actually cause accidents. Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger both indicated that. And one story that Dr. Jung used to tell was that there was a man he was seeing in Zurich who one day he ran into on the street. He was actually across the street, and the man shouted over and said that he had had a couple of dreams of falling off the mountain, and because he was a mountain climber. And I never really, and Dr. Jung said, well, you shouldn't go mountain climbing anymore. That'll be very dangerous for you. And for the longest time, I didn't really understand what he was saying, but anyway, in the story, 3 months later, the man did step off into space and fell off the mountain and died. And what he was saying was that that when the psyche says something like that to you, you should pay attention. And if you have a dream like that, you should definitely pay attention to it and try to understand what your psyche thinks you need. I had a similar experience. I don't recall specific dreams, but well, I don't recall specific dreams, but certainly I was doing a lot of things in 1989 and 1990, and I was trying to get going on a business that later became a public company 15 years later. But in the fall of 1989, I became aware of this business and the possibility of building it up. And I was also active in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve at the time. I was serving as a lieutenant colonel, and I was serving as the reserve counterpart to the head of standards branch of the U.S. Marine Corps. So my branch, when I was serving in my reserve duties, was to write the performance standards of the U.S. Marine Corps. And but that was a very time-consuming and lawyerly kind of job also. And on January the 4th, 1990, I was in uniform on Marine Corps Base Quantico. I had just parked my car, and there was very slippery ice there, and I was very focused on what I was going to do that day in my Marine Corps assignment. And I was hurrying across the parking lot, and bang, I went down. And I looked down at my foot, and it was literally off my leg. It was separated from my leg, still attached by skin, but not much else. And it was, you have to be very careful on days when there's ice on the road, and then it gets a little bit warm, and that ice gets very, very slippery. But in any case, I broke my leg in two places, and the Marines sent the ambulance to pick me up, and the shotgun for the ambulance driver jumped out and came around the ambulance, and he slipped down and dislocated his shoulder, so he had to jump in the back of the ambulance with me. And off we went, and I ended up having that repaired at Bethesda, and it turned out to be an all right repair, but just 2 months ago now I had to have that ankle replaced, and so now it's actually much better. But my point is that may well have been the same type of thing, where my psyche was telling me, slow down, you can't do all this stuff, you can't go build this company if you're going to be running off for the Marine Corps all the time. And so that, in fact, was the last thing I did in uniform officially. I do still have my uniforms, and occasionally I perform an honor salute for our local hospice, but other than that, I don't have any official duties any longer. And so I do think that there are messages from the psyche, and you better pay attention to them because they can be deadly. Dr. Edinger talked about, you can cut yourself with a chainsaw or something like that. And so you have to be aware. Let's see. Yeah, Grace says, if we don't address our psyche, it will address us. Quite so. And, my psyche gives me very clear messages. I mean, as I said, even today, I've been struggling with my other work that I need to do, and my psyche was telling me, you know, you need a Sabbath, you need some time off, you need to do something that I, the psyche, think you need to do, and that's doing this video right now, which is I actually have no choice but to do it, and so these days, I mean, in the last few years, I've rather been bemused by it, but that is the way it is, and we need to be conscious of these things. I've been talking for close to an hour. Are there any other thoughts? Otherwise, I will put further comment off until tomorrow for the reading group regular meeting, and in that meeting, I'm going to play the little bit at the beginning of this video, which is about speaking in tongues, because I want to talk about that and about how Dr. Jung was speaking from the self, and how the three psychologists all felt that he was speaking to them. And I think that that's an important concept, and we can talk about it in the context of American fundamentalists who speak in tongues and what that means. Let's see, Grace says, can you talk about your process of listening to your conscious or psyche? Let's see. I wouldn't say that there's a definable process per se. Certainly, I try to take dreams seriously, and lately I have resumed the practice of writing down my dreams, and even if I get awakened at 2 in the morning with a dream, if I can remember what the dream is, I will get myself up into my table and write into my dream journal what the dream was, because normally by the morning I won't remember it. And yet when I wake up and read what I've written, some really profound things come to my attention. And I'm fortunate that I live with Phi Beta Kappa, who is very smart. She is way smarter than I am, and she is familiar with symbology. So sometimes when I can't work out a dream, I talk to her about it, and the interaction with her often helps me get my mind around what the dream is trying to say to me. And it's always profound. It's very often very profound, but it's always profound and important when I am able to do that. So I can highly recommend that practice and taking dreams seriously, because your dreams are telling you something. For example, the mountain climber in Switzerland, if he had paid attention to his dream, maybe he wouldn't have fallen off the mountain 3 months later. But his dream was trying to tell him something, and Dr. Jung knew that and warned him about not doing mountain climbing anymore, but he went ahead anyway. But one important thing is that when you get down to the self, there are two streams. There's the shadow stream, and there's we could say it's the light side and the shadow side. Now, the shadow isn't always bad, because the shadow helps us have psychic energy. So we have to recognize first that the shadow is not always bad. But we have to then take the two streams. One is a conscious side and one is an unconscious side, or an ego side and a self side, and we have to evaluate what the dream is telling us in terms of the 21st century and in terms of our everyday life. So, as Dr. Jung used to say it, and I don't recall exactly what the Latin is, but he used to say we have to test the spirits and realize that the psyche is coming out at us in both streams, okay, in both sides of the opposites. And so when we're getting a message from the psyche, we have to then evaluate that message in terms of of our 21st century life. And at the same time, you don't want to sometimes things that the psyche says that it wants, you don't want to bring into your actual life. You shouldn't do. And there are many of these. I've privately talked about some of these with you, Gray, but at some point I'll address some of those again, not in the context, not now when I've identified our conversation, but at some other point I will do. But the point is that our psyche sometimes tells us it wants us to do things, and we shouldn't, and we should be conscious enough, ego conscious enough to make that decision. But very often I get useful messages from my psyche, and I've mentioned a few times that when I get a vision of a police car, it's always the same vision. It's a black and white police car with the word police written across the side of it, and it appears to cross in front of me from right to left. When I get that vision, no matter when it is, I always slow down and pay attention, because within 2 minutes I will see some police activity. Very often it's a speed trap or something like that, but it may be, an accident beside the road or anything else that might involve the police. But in any case, that vision always warns me about a minute or two in advance that I'm going to see police activity. Now, maybe that can be explained by seeing changes in the speed of oncoming traffic or something like that. It certainly works in that way for me. In other words, a lot of people feel they need to have a radar detector on their dashboard, and that when they go by police, they hide it if it's illegal in your state. But many people do have radar detectors in their cars. I have no need of that, because whenever I'm near a speed trap on the highway, I have that vision, and it warns me. And so I've learned to pay attention to that. And by vision, I mean, as we go along in life, we're thinking about things all the time, and we have, we think in images, so images come up. And so when if you turn off the radio and then you start to pay attention to the images that come to mind as you're going along, you can find correspondences like that, like my police car, because I started to notice about 30 years ago that anytime I had that vision, within a minute or two, I would see some police activity, and very often it was a speed trap. And I'm sure other things come to mind also very often. And so you need to pay attention to these things and learn. Now, as it happened, when I broke my leg, I was flat on my back for 13 weeks. It took 13 weeks to repair. And so what had started in the fall of '89, I then resumed, and that then led to a series of events which led to taking a company public in 2005. And that's a very long story, as you might guess, but the point is that maybe my psyche was, in a very rough way, telling me to focus on that opportunity and not on the opportunity of trying to become a general officer in the Marine Corps Reserve. And so fortunately, I had enough years of activity in the Marine Corps that I was able to retire, and that helped me, and always has. Let's see. Roland Benner says, I tried to fight the psyche and the psyche won. That's why I'm here. Precisely. I think, and certainly that's why I'm here. And, you know, when I think about this piece that I read about speaking in tongues, and especially about the reaction of the three psychologists who went to a talk of Dr. Jung's, I find that whenever I have any difficulty in life that I'm facing, if I pick up one of Jung's direct books and begin to read anywhere in the book, it calms me down. And does it directly address my concerns? Very often it does. I mean, there's surprising synchronicity there, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, it does calm me down. And you know, I'm quite intuitive, and so I recognize these things having effect on me. And, you know, I basically think of Dr. Jung as my shrink. And there's a famous story that Dr. Jung told of a man, an Indian man who came to visit him, and he was quite a prominent Indian man. And Dr. Jung said to him, well, who is your guru? And the man gave a name, and Dr. Jung said, do you mean the guru who lived in the 13th century? And the Indian said, yes, I mean him. and so ironically, I used to think of, I started thinking of Joseph Campbell as my guru. And years ago now, probably, must have been 87 or something like that, I heard on NPR about a book about Joseph Campbell's life called Fire in the Mind. It's a very worthwhile book. I highly recommend it. It's called Fire in the Mind. And it's a biography of Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell had a variety of experiences in his early life in particular. He, let's see, who... can't remember. He was living with a famous author back in the early days, back in the late 30s or early 40s, in California. I think they were living on a houseboat or something like that, and so there were some very interesting stories in that book. But that got me interested in Joseph Campbell, so I started to read a lot of his work, and then I lost respect for him, unfortunately, and the way that happened was that, well, it was two things. One was that Joseph Campbell had been very taken by James Joyce's book, Finnegan's Wake. And he actually wrote a book called Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. So Joseph Campbell was sort of working in the way that Edinger worked with Dr. Jung's work. Joseph Campbell was working with James Joyce's work. And Finnegan's Wake, as you may know if you've tried to read it, is a very complicated and difficult book to read. And it's layered about at least 8 or 10 layers deep, almost every word in it, especially in the first 40 or 50 pages. And if you're not familiar with the ancient references that James Joyce uses in the beginning of Finnegan's Wake, you're just not going to get it. It's very difficult to understand when you first pick it up. I remember picking it up in college because some part of it was required for my freshman or sophomore English lit class, and I probably got through no more than a page. But one of the interesting things about Finnegan's Wake is that it begins with the end of a sentence, and it ends with the beginning of the same sentence. So it is round, and it is referring, that sentence is referring to the river Libby, I think, that goes through Dublin, and how it's a constant cycle of the water going out to sea and then coming back and raining down and coming down the river again. And so it's also a reference to the round of life. And so, but if you didn't know that he was using that artifice, you wouldn't even realize that the beginning of the sentence was the last part, the very last words in the book, until you got to the end of the book, and you'd have to be very good attention span to even realize that that was there. You'd get to the end of the sentence and you'd say, okay, why did it sort of just trail off? And ironically, that's what happens in the Red Book, in Dr. Jung's Red Book, which I can show you in a minute. But the point was that that Campbell went to the opening of By the Skin of Our Teeth, which was a play by Oscar Wilde. And halfway through the play, he got up very angrily and made comments to the rest of the audience that this was plagiarism of Finnegan's Wake. And he stormed out of the premiere very noticeably. And I thought that was quite ironic because Joseph Campbell, in much of his writing, was actually plagiarizing Carl Jung in much the same way. So that was one realization that I had. But in fairness, I have to say that I like a lot of Joseph Campbell's work and books, and I still have them on my shelf. And so anyway, there was this other thing, though, where I was listening to audio tapes again, and I was listening to an audio tape with Joseph Campbell back in, the very early 90s, I would say. And it was after I had broken my leg, and so I was starting that business, and I was doing a lot of traveling salesman type work at that time. And I remember sitting in the, believe it or not, I remember explicitly sitting in the parking lot of Onslow Memorial Hospital in Jacksonville, North Carolina. That's exactly where I was when I heard this part of this tape. And there was a question and answer period in the tape. And one of the women in the audience got up and asked him, well, Dr. Campbell, what is the meaning of life? And Joseph Campbell was very derisive, and it was after this that I turned off toward him, because he said, oh, there's no meaning to life, there's only an experience of life. And of course, that's one thing he didn't plagiarize from Dr. Jung, because Dr. Jung did say that everybody has to have meaning in their lives, or we're going to have problems psychologically. And so, but I didn't know that at the time. I just was turned off by the way he handled that question. And that was sort of the end for me in terms of paying attention to Joseph Campbell. And I think it was shortly after that I started to pick up some of the Jungian analysts' recent works, like Women Who Run with the Wolves, and Gods in Every Woman, and or Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man by Jean Shinoda Bolen. The first other one was by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Those are excellent books, by the way. I highly recommend them, but I started to read those in lieu of Joseph Campbell, and so going back to Gray's question about my process, if I find some blockage, that something is preventing me from doing something, for example, doing the work that I have to do sometime this coming week, or preparing for an exam, a major exam in my higher education, something like that. I very often find myself blocked and can't bring myself to even study until the very end. And then when there's enough psychic pressure, psychic energy pushing on me, saying, you've got to study now, then I do it, okay? And, but I often find myself blocked, and so that's one example. It would be an example of, you have to do something, but something in you keeps resisting, in the form of, well, let's say you want to do some writing today, but first you have to get your desk set up just right, and then you have to get yourself a coffee, and then you're feeling, oh, I'm a little hungry, so I think I'll go get a cookie. And then, oh, I forgot to tell my wife something, so I better get up and go tell her something. And things keep coming up, and you don't get to what you're doing or what you're trying to do. Then that's how I recognize that myself is trying to tell me something. When I feel that there's something really important to do, like I really wanted to do this reading today, then I just I go online on YouTube and I set the time that I'm going to be online, and then I feel like I have to do it. And that does help. That's a motivator to get something started, because I find once I get started, then there's no problem, but it's just getting over that first hurdle. And so anyway, yeah. I like Gray's comment. Of course it calms you down. It's Jung Fu. That's very good. Yeah. So if you find that sort of thing happening in your life, though, where have to you have to do something, but you keep coming up with excuses why you can't do it. Oh, I've got to go mow the lawn instead of doing this, or you have to have a conversation with your wife, let's say, or your husband. That would be another example where you know you're going to have a difficult conversation, but you keep putting it off, or you keep finding other reasons why it's not going to happen in this minute. That's a sure sign of something from yourself. It might be telling you, maybe you shouldn't talk about this. Sometimes there are things that should stay unconscious. Okay, sometimes there are things that you shouldn't say to your spouse. I mean, I remember, there are a lot of very meaningful passages in the movie The Godfather. But at the end of the movie, there's a scene where Kay comes to Michael and she says, I want to ask you about your business. And he says, I told you you can never ask me about my business. And she says, but, I have to ask you. And he says, fine, this one time I will let you ask me about my business, but never again. Is that understood? And she says, yes. And so she asks him something like, did you kill the men who killed Santino, his brother, who was killed in the movie? And he says no. And obviously this was a lie. So he says no. And then in this very pregnant moment, he goes into his office and I think it's Clemenza closes the door, the big heavy door. And so the point is that in your marriage, sometimes there are things that shouldn't be shared. In that case, he was protecting his wife from his criminal behavior. And so I'm not condoning the criminal behavior, but I'm saying that, there are times when you don't necessarily want to discuss something with your spouse, and you shouldn't. And if you find your psyche resisting having the conversation, you ought to pay attention to that. But keeping in mind, they're the two streams, so you have to decide which stream is the correct stream. This is individuation. This is making the moral judgment about what you should say and bring into the relationship, and what you should not say. And I certainly have experience with that. And there's one other rule, and I think this is a rule that I can share with others in terms of having a strong marital relationship, and that is that, there are going to be fights or spats. And the rule is, if you ever have a fight, no matter what it's about, when it's over, it has to be over entirely. There has to be an agreement between you that whenever there's a fight, on whatever topic, it doesn't matter what the topic is, it will never be brought up again. And if you have that rule, it will strengthen your relationship, because I know that I lost my first marriage because every time there was a dispute between me and my first wife, she would bring up every transgression since the beginning of the relationship. And so, she'd just pile it on and pile it on and pile it on. and ultimately she just piled it on too much. It's like a drip on porcelain. Eventually the porcelain wears through. And so one piece of advice that I've had in my life, and I urge upon anybody that sees this video, is if you ever have a fight with your spouse for whatever reason, once it's over, you may never speak of it again. You agree that you will never speak of that incident again. And I've had a few with my current wife. We've been together for quite some time now, 33 years, going on 33 years. And we've had that understanding between us, and it's served us quite well, I think. So anyway, that's a long chat, and so there's some things to think about, and I will be online tomorrow again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and I urge you to join us then on this channel. And it's on the live stream part of this channel, so you'll have to, if you're watching live, it's on the link that you currently have. If you're watching this in replay, then it's on the live link for this channel. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining. Nice to see you all. Thanks for joining. And I'm going to stop streaming now.